disadvantage of giving this last is a lot of what I was going to say has already been said. But thank you to my mom and dad sitting back there. They've supported me through a lot, and they've obviously provided a lot of time, energy, and money to help me succeed in this activity. I'd like to thank Kyle Victory Morris for getting my baker started over at Kincaid. Great guy. He's no longer in the activity, but his spirit is still with us. Jenny Almay, who was the director of debate at Westminster when I was a novice. She took me in and dealt with all the trouble I caused and taught me pretty much everything that got me started in the debate world. I'd like to thank our current coach, Jordana Sternberg. She stepped in 2 years ago and did a fantastic job taking over the team. We were a little bit disoriented, but she definitely did a fantastic job pulling it all together, and Mama was right, she's certainly very influential. Our lab leaders over the years, I've spent a lot of time with Naman over the summer, so a lot of these names will sound familiar from about 10 minutes ago. But back when I was very young and confused about today, Bill Repko, Katie Jervin, Dave Strauss, and Julia Butler. I spent junior year with Chris Jordan, David the Machine Height, JP, and Alex. And lastly, this past year, Callum Matheson, Jared Atchison, Louis Surgeon Leventhal, and sorry if I forgot your name, Andre Skin, and Dana Randall. Thanks to Emory for hosting such a wonderful tournament. It's run super smooth. Herndon has been great, very funny host, very calm and welcoming in general. Thanks to Melissa Wade for hosting such a fantastic tournament, and in general, kind of everything she's done for the activity has been fantastic and fun to watch. Thanks to all our assistants, Marquise, D-Herm, Steven, D-Height. We're going to miss you next year. He's at the Dartmouth Round Robin right now, doing what he does best. But best of luck to him in the future, and everyone on the Westminster squad, all my friends throughout the debate community who have made this activity blessed. And with that, it will just be the second half of his last speech, so the routine. Are we all good to go? Fantastic. So Kalen did a very good job of describing why his impacts are true in the abstract, but there was a problem with the 2AC. You will not hear the phrase human security throughout the entirety of the speech. This is our advocacy and the alternative to the affirmative investment in icebreakers. Decentering the state as the locus for political intervention into the Arctic is necessary. This is analogous to the stance of the Canadian Rangers, who draw on indigenous knowledge. They had to distance themselves from security, Canadian Arctic policy, for integrating security into their own lives, community-based activities. However, policy responses justify the development of mega projects that destroy their homes and habitat, and the habitat of crucial species that substantially wreck their quality of life. This is one example of the policy intervention that the affirmative takes in the Arctic that co-opts both our alternative through the permutation. Now, there's an internal contradiction throughout the entirety of their advocacy. Their 1AC describes Russia as a threat and something that we need to respond to with anti-submarine warfare capabilities. The 2AC, in response to our argument, made a drastic pivot to say that the 1AC, actually, Russia is a friend and we should extend a helping hand out to them. You should not let them do this. Their description of the Arctic that they use to justify deployment of icebreakers is problematic and a flawed version of the way international politics operate. Our first link is about the Arctic. The way we represent the Arctic as a national security threat justifies massive state-sanctioned violence to secure a sustainable U.S. presence. The idea that we need to win this great race to secure resources in the Arctic is a liberalist ploy. Neo-realist descriptions of human nature purposely obscure and misrepresent the way sovereignty operates, especially in the Arctic, where it has not yet taken hold. Now, dystopian images of the Arctic as a locus of all societal disaster are constantly misrepresented as a massive security risk, only be able to solve by direct intervention by the federal government. However, as opposed to that, the status quo of the Arctic is a space without state security. It's one of the few places where security exists in the form of human security, where we attempt to protect individual rights and sovereignty rather than the geopolitical statist violence of the place. The rhetoric of aggressive arms raising in the region is used to justify a Western colonial narrative that calls for diplomacy efforts under the guise of science diplomacy i.e. them saying that we're the National Science Foundation, and we're opening kind of a multilateral dialogue with them, which was not how they described it in the 1AC, through resource exploitation, which ultimately collapses cooperative dialogues and turns the case. That's the piece of Dittmer evidence we read in the 1AC. Even if they're generally right about the way international relations operates writ large, not in the context of the Arctic, there are two things that make it unique. One is there's no international architecture in place to solidify international norms. The Arctic is relatively undeveloped and means we stand at a unique point. We can either reify orthodox international relations by repeating the same narrative about the US being the foundational security hegemon, or we can use this as an opportunity to create a new relationship in the world that realizes human stewardship as a primary goal. Second, this is not responded to in the second affirmative constructive, is that it's a very complex environment. Intervention into the Arctic is in the very early stages, and we don't quite know how it operates or what effect US policy would have on the region, which means that you should view their true claims very suspectfully. They say history is on our side. How on earth did critiquing US policy lead to the Cold War? We instead argue that the Cold War was a result of lack of interrogation of national policies. If we realized that Russia did not control material capabilities and did not hype up the security threat continually, that would have broken down to arms racing drastically before it escalated to the point that it did. Second is recall the 1AC process, where I asked Alden how to describe how our current national security situation is analogous to the Cold War. He cited on-the-ground military deployments in the Arctic to justify this repetition of the Cold War rhetoric, which proves that they just lead to arms racing in the long term. If they win that their submarine presence in the Arctic inherently destabilizes the region, then you should vote for us to withdraw US presence from the region and demilitarize the Arctic to allow for cooperative international relations. Now, how many times are we going to use the Cold War to justify demonizing Russia as an entity? We should stop and break with this narrative, because if we keep using this justification, we'll never break out of this Cold War antagonism. Now, they say you should vote affirmative to solve for a probability of extinction, and they cite this Bostrom evidence. One is there's not really an answer to the 1NC argument that Bostrom later changed his mind. He said the nuclear war with Russia would not lead to extinction because they decommissioned a lot of their nuclear weapons, which means that even if it was true during the Cold War, we have safeguards in check now that prevent escalation of this conflict. Second is they're using the threat of extinction to justify another form of interventionary politics, which means that you should view this claim highly suspectly. They have no explanation of how the entire human species will become extinct as a result of some accident with a submarine in the Arctic. That's kind of ridiculous. And we've had submarines in the Arctic since January of last year, and none of them have bumped into each other, or if they have, it hasn't caused anything of a result to kind of lead to human extinction, which they use as a justify. Nuclear war won't cause extinction, which means their hyperbolic risk calculus does not apply. This is Martin in '82. Major global nuclear war, in which the US, Soviet Union, Europe, and China partnered with no civil defense, could kill 450 million people tops, far from extinction. Even in the most extreme case, there would remain 9/10 of the world population. Areas upwind of attacks would remain free of contamination. Scientific evidence provides no basis, no convincing scientific arguments that nuclear war would cause extinction. Statements that nuclear war would lead to the death of all people should be considered exaggeration. They say their method is compatible with ours. They are certainly not going to win that their first speech was that Russia is a friend and we should help them. They describe the Arctic as, quote, an arena for the next stage of great power politics in their 1AC evidence, which was a quote I read in the cross-examination. This is overly reductionist, and that papers over the fact that we have not reached the threshold of arms militarization now. Russian threat construction is outdated. Realists have fear-mongered about Russia for years, but none of their predictions have come true. Even if it has, via intervention in Ukraine, it's been highly de-escalated and certainly not come close to human extinction. These constant predictions of war leave no choice but to prepare for war and engage in heightened threat perception to justify U.S. diplomatic standing, which exacerbates militarism. Now, this parasitical framing relates to the problem, or recreates the problems they seek to solve. Now, when we encounter difference, we immediately jump to security. For example, when the U.S. wants to claim intellectual property rights over different biological organisms elsewhere, we construct the populations that control them as a perpetual other. We need to reformulate an ethic that makes us all able to participate together in a kind of cosmopolitan politics that allows for peaceful, multilateral interactions. Only we allow for an epistemic shift away from current forms of international politics. They say we must have a specific pragmatic policy. The McLean argument suggests that our alternative abandons politics for pure criticism. This is not true. We advocate for human security, which means reformulating democratic politics to allow for collective action via individuals, instead of focusing all our kind of political will behind technocratic state-sanctioned violence. Now, You are an educator. If we win their 1AC was a bad form of scholarship, and their theory of IR is not true in the context of the Arctic, we should win. You should vote them down because the 1AC was not a presentation of reality, but was epistemically flawed. In the context of the Arctic, the way we talk about it inherently shapes material on-the-ground conditions and policy interventions because it's inherently not developed to the full extent as other international relations. This is Grindheim and Mack. The Arctic regions are what we make them to be. They are created by text and speech. The creation has consequences and impact on political accomplishments. The act of speech that portrays a topic as a security matter can help to show whether the two actors characterize and frame the region as security concerns. The world is accessible only through representation. There's no objective truth. Representations are the closest we will ever get to reality. We have beaten them to the race to specificity on this issue. We read evidence in the context of the Arctic and say the way we talk about it is crucially important. Absolutely.
You make the claim that the 1AC did not discuss elements of Russian cooperation, but I will read you the line from the piece of AV evidence in the 1AC. The need for cooperation with Russia despite disputes, let's exercise leadership now by developing icebreakers. The Arctic demands cooperation. How did the 1AC not discuss cooperation in the context of Arctic?
Absolutely. That is why your 1AC made little to no sense. You read a bunch of pieces of evidence about why we should cooperate with Russia, and then you described them as a security threat.
I just read the word icebreakers, that we need increased icebreakers. It's the reason why we need to get infrastructure that is necessary.
That's why there's an internal contradiction. You say they're militarizing the Arctic now, so we need to kind of present the threat of deterrent capability to the U.S. so we can then begin to cooperate. That is a contradiction because it doesn't allow us to extend an open hand to Russia and realize that they may not be the security.
Is your argument that the United States is in the Arctic now, or no?
That's totally irrelevant to the...
Why? If the United States is in the Arctic now, shouldn't it have provoked the conflict that you already discussed?
No, your affirmative says that if the U.S. is in the Arctic, then we would be able to have a deterrent posture towards Russia. We currently don't have that posture, so we should use this as a...
You've made the argument that Russia's been in the Arctic